On June 28, 1776, 9 British warships entered the approaches to Charlestown carrying more than 270 guns. Waiting for them on Sullivan's Island was an unfinished fort, armed with only 31 cannon. Its rear was open, its garrison had never fought a naval battle, and its commander possessed so little powder that wasteful firing could end the defense before sunset. By every familiar measure of 18th century warfare, the Royal Navy held the advantage. Yet the British plan rested on 3 assumptions: that their army could cross a shallow inlet, that naval gunfire would break the fort, and that inexperienced defenders would lose their nerve. Before the day was over, all 3 assumptions had failed. The battle that followed did not turn on a single miracle, and it was not won by palmetto-logs alone. Geography, construction, discipline, local labor, faulty intelligence, and divided British command all mattered. At the center of that combination stood Colonel William Moultrie, a South Carolina planter and politician whose military experience came not from European siege schools, but from militia service in the Cherokee War. His achievement on Sullivan's Island would make him a revolutionary hero. It would also leave South Carolina with one of its most enduring symbols. But first, the British had to be persuaded that this exposed island was the key to the harbor. Early in 1776, Britain was searching for a way to recover the initiative in its rebellious colonies. General Henry Clinton sailed south from Boston in January with a small force. Off Cape Fear, North Carolina, he joined Lord Charles Cornwallis and 7 regiments that had crossed the Atlantic under the protection of Commodore Sir Peter Parker's squadron. Their instructions were to support Southern loyalists, restore royal authority where possible, and then join General William Howe for the coming campaign around New York. Atlantic weather delayed Parker and Cornwallis, while Clinton waited without the local rising British officials had expected. With Howe eventually needing the force in the north, the commanders wanted a result. Charlestown promised a swift and prestigious success, encouraging them to treat incomplete intelligence as sufficient. The operation moved forward because the fort appeared weak, not because the British had solved the practical problems surrounding it. The Southern plan had already begun to unravel. At Moore's Creek Bridge in February, Patriot forces defeated a Loyalist column before it could unite with British regulars. The uprising on which the expedition had depended was no longer available. Clinton considered moving toward the Chesapeake, while Parker favored an attack on Charlestown. British intelligence described the fort on Sullivan's Island as unfinished and vulnerable to a sudden blow. The island guarded the channel into the harbor. If the British seized it, warships could threaten the city and perhaps establish a secure base on the southern coast. The opportunity appeared too valuable to ignore. Charlestown was among the wealthiest ports in British North America. Rice and indigo connected it to markets across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. That wealth rested heavily on enslaved labor, both in the surrounding plantation country and within the commercial system of the port. The city was therefore not only a strategic harbor, it was the political and economic center of a colony whose leaders had committed themselves to resistance. Its capture would damage the rebellion in the south and offer Britain a visible answer to the loss of Boston. The city's defenders understood the same stakes. Batteries guarded the harbor, militia units mobilized, and Continental troops from Virginia and North Carolina entered the region. By the time Lee arrived, roughly 6,500 defenders were dispersed around Charlestown, only about half of them Continentals. The unfinished fort was part of that wider network, but it was the position where the Royal Navy could concentrate its power most directly. The harbor entrance, however, imposed its own rules. Sandbars restricted the movement of deep-draft warships. Tides shaped every approach. Sullivan's Island stretched across the seaward side of the harbor, while Breach Inlet separated its northern end from Long Island, known today as the Isle of Palms. A fort near the southern end could fire on vessels attempting to pass into the harbor. A defending force at the northern end could block troops trying to reach the fort by land. Any successful British operation required the Army and Navy to overcome both positions at roughly the same time. Construction on the Sullivan's Island fort began before Moultrie assumed direct command there in March. South Carolinians, including soldiers, mechanics, and enslaved African laborers, cut and placed thousands of palmetto logs. The design used 2 parallel log walls with the space between them packed with sand. It was intended to become a large enclosed fortification capable of holding about 1,000 men. By June, only the seaward face and portions of the sides were ready for combat. The landward side remained dangerously incomplete, and the position looked less like a finished fortress than a building site armed in haste. Its apparent simplicity concealed a useful distribution of force. The outer logs slowed an incoming ball, the sand absorbed and spread the impact, and the inner structure helped contain the mass. Damage that would send long, lethal splinters through a conventional timber wall was often localized inside the palmetto and sand. The fort was not invulnerable. Open embrasures, exposed gun crews, and unfinished walls still offered targets, and a successful flanking movement could bypass the strongest face. But Parker's planned frontal bombardment was aimed directly at the portion best able to endure it. The man ordered to hold it had spent much of his life far from professional military institutions. William Moultrie was born in Charlestown on November 23, 1730, the son of physician John Moultrie and Lucretia Cooper Moultrie. At 19, he married Elizabeth de Marius de St. Julian. The marriage strengthened his place within South Carolina's landed elite. By 1761, he owned a rice plantation and about 200 enslaved people. His political and military career grew from that privileged world, and the contradiction would remain part of his legacy, a prominent defender of American liberty whose wealth and status depended on slavery. Moultrie entered the Commons House of Assembly in 1752. During the Cherokee War, he received a captain's commission in the South Carolina militia and gained practical experience commanding troops in difficult country. By 1774, he had reached the rank of colonel. When South Carolina organized provincial forces in 1775, he became colonel of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. He was not a naval officer or a trained military engineer. He was, however, accustomed to local terrain, militia organization, uncertain supplies, and decisions made without ideal conditions. That background shaped his style of command. Moultrie was not known for the rigid manner Lee expected from a European professional, and Lee worried that he was too easy with his men. Yet the colonel could hold a position, delegate to officers who understood their tasks, and preserve composure while conditions changed. On Sullivan's Island, command would depend less on elaborate maneuver than on maintaining a few essential rules for an entire day. Stay at the guns, do not waste powder, and keep the enemy from passing the fort. He also gave his regiment a flag. It used a dark blue field resembling the color of the soldiers' coats, with a white crescent in the upper corner. Moultrie later remembered it as the first American flag displayed in South Carolina during the Revolution. Its precise symbolism has been debated, but its place in the state's visual history is clear. In June 1776, it flew above the unfinished works on Sullivan's Island, where its meaning would be shaped less by design than by survival. Major General Charles Lee arrived in Charlestown on June 8 as commander of the Continental Army's newly created Southern Department. He brought broad military experience and found the island fort deeply troubling. Its incomplete rear seemed to invite disaster. Lee dismissed the Palmetto Works as a slaughter pen and warned Moultrie that ships lying alongside the fort would knock it down in half an hour. He ordered an emergency bridge of empty hogsheads prepared across the cove behind the position so that the garrison might escape to the mainland. Lee's judgment was not irrational. If British frigates passed around the fort and fired into its unfinished side while infantry attacked from the north, Moultrie's command could be trapped. Lee pressed South Carolina's president, John Rutledge, to support an evacuation. Rutledge refused. He told Moultrie not to leave without a direct order from him and declared that he would sooner cut off his hand than write one. The fort would remain occupied. Moultrie now had to prove that local materials and controlled fire could compensate for everything the position lacked. This disagreement was not merely a contest between courage and fear. Lee had to consider the defense of the entire city and could not easily replace a regiment lost on an island. Rutledge believed abandoning the harbor entrance would surrender the initiative before the battle began. Moultrie believed the fort could survive if the ships were held at a distance and his men did not exhaust their ammunition. Each man was judging a different risk. Rutledge's decision forced the question to be answered under fire. The British Army faced a problem of its own at Breach Inlet. Pilots had reported that the channel between Long Island and Sullivan's Island became a ford at low tide. Clinton expected water only about 18 inches deep. A closer examination found a channel roughly 100 yards wide and about 7 feet deep, even at low water. It was too deep for infantry to wade and too shallow for a major warship to enter and provide close support. The British possessed only 15 flat-bottomed boats, not enough to carry more than a fraction of the army in a single crossing. Clinton therefore reduced the land operation to a diversion. Across the inlet, Colonel William Thompson commanded about 800 defenders, including riflemen, artillerymen, and 30 allied Catawba warriors. They had built breastworks of earth and palmetto and positioned 2 cannon to cover the water. Even if Clinton could send troops across in boats, they would arrive in separated groups under direct fire. The supposed easy approach to the rear of Moultrie's fort had become one of the strongest parts of the American defense. Parker continued with the naval attack. On the morning of June 28, Moultrie was visiting Thompson's northern position when a lookout reported that the ships were moving. He hurried back and called the garrison to its posts. Inside the fort were a little more than 400 men and 31 cannon of several sizes. Many of the defenders were infantrymen learning the work of heavy guns under battle conditions. Their greatest limitation was powder. Moultrie understood that the British could fire faster and far longer. His answer was deliberate economy. Aim carefully, concentrate on the nearest ships, and refuse to spend ammunition merely to answer every enemy broadside. The bomb vessel Thunder opened the attack, followed by the main warships. The 50-gun Bristol, Parker's flagship, and the 50-gun Experiment formed the center of the assault, supported by the smaller Active and Solubi. Parker hoped to bring his vessels close enough for grapeshot, but the uncertain bottom kept the larger ships about 500 yards from the fort. That distance reduced some of the advantage the British expected from their heavier concentration of fire. Even so, the broadsides began with overwhelming force, and the fort disappeared repeatedly behind smoke, sand, and flying debris. Thunder added high-arcing mortar fire to the broadsides. Early in the action, one shell struck the American magazine but failed to explode, an accident that spared the fort from a potentially catastrophic loss of powder. Parker had been told that local pilots could place the ships much closer to the parapets. Those pilots, some of them enslaved African Americans with knowledge of the harbor, would not take the larger vessels into the shallow water he wanted. Whether their caution reflected accurate seamanship, deliberate resistance, or both cannot be established with certainty. The effect was clear. The ships fought farther away than Parker had intended. What the British shot did not produce was a collapsing wall. Palmetto trunks were fibrous and yielding rather than brittle. Iron balls that might have shattered harder timbers often buried themselves in the logs. The deep sand between the walls absorbed additional energy. Some shots passed through unfinished sections or struck gun positions, and the bombardment was deadly to men caught in exposed places. But the fort's main seaward face remained usable. A structure that looked crude by European standards proved unusually well suited to the material violence directed against it. Moultrie's gunners answered at a much slower pace. They waited for clear targets and directed much of their fire against Bristol and Experiment. This was not perfect artillery drill. Guns recoiled, smoke obscured the water, and ammunition had to be managed through long hours. Yet the Americans maintained enough order to make their limited shots count. Rutledge sent an additional 700 pounds of powder across the cove with instructions to keep the cannon cool and do damage. The reinforcement allowed Moultrie to sustain the defense without abandoning the restraint that had preserved his supply. The contrast in target selection mattered. British crews fired at a low fortification whose walls blended with sand and whose guns were separated along the parapet. American crews fired at tall wooden hulls carrying dense concentrations of men, rigging, cannon, and command personnel. A hit against a palmetto wall might disappear into the works. A hit along a warship's deck or through its side could splinter timber, disable a gun, cut a line, or strike several sailors. Each side was using 18th century artillery, but the physical consequences of a hit were radically different. The effect aboard Bristol was devastating. The flagship was struck about 70 times. Rigging was cut, spars were damaged, and the quarterdeck became a place of repeated casualties. 40 men aboard Bristol were killed and 71 wounded. Captain John Morris suffered a terrible wound and later died. Lord William Campbell, South Carolina's deposed royal governor, was hit by a splinter while serving below deck. The injury contributed to his death 2 years later. Parker himself was wounded, and the blast damage tore away his breeches, an episode that British critics and American satirists quickly turned into public humiliation. Experiment also suffered heavily, and her captain, Alexander Scott, lost an arm. Across the squadron, British losses exceeded 200 killed and wounded. The imbalance did not come from a greater American rate of fire. The fort offered a difficult target, while the wooden hulls and crowded decks of the anchored ships remained exposed to carefully directed solid shot. The Royal Navy was expending enormous quantities of powder and iron without achieving the result on which Parker's plan depended. The fighting also revealed how quickly command could be degraded aboard a ship. Officers and messengers had to remain visible on decks swept by fragments. Damaged masts and rigging restricted movement, even when the hull still floated. Gun crews worked amid smoke, blood, and debris, while orders passed through a shrinking group of unwounded leaders. Parker's squadron did not lose the ability to fire, but it steadily lost the ability to turn that fire into a decisive tactical change. The ships could punish the fort. They could not make it surrender. At the northern end of Sullivan's Island, Clinton attempted the promised diversion with his flat-bottomed boats. Thompson's men opened fire from prepared positions, and the flotilla could make no meaningful progress across the inlet. The British Army never delivered the full rear assault that the Navy expected. This failure was more than a missed opportunity. It exposed the weakness of the entire joint operation. Clinton and Parker had agreed on an objective without securing a workable method for combining their forces against it. Parker also tried to create a crossfire from the harbor side. He ordered Actaeon, Sphinx, and Siren to pass around the fort toward the anchorage known as Rebellion Road. From there, they could attack the unfinished defenses, threaten the escape route, and place the garrison between two directions of fire. Instead, all three frigates ran aground on the lower middle ground. Sphinx and Siren eventually worked free. The 28-gun Actaeon remained trapped. The maneuver that might have exposed Moultrie's weakest face had been stopped by the harbor bottom. This grounding was the naval counterpart to the mistake at Breach Inlet. In both places, the British plan assumed that local water could be crossed in a way the actual depth would not allow. At the inlet, soldiers could not wade where they had expected a ford. Near the fort, frigates could not complete a turn through the shoals without striking bottom. The same harbor that made Charlestown valuable also protected it through a geography the attackers had not mastered. At about 3 in the afternoon, the defenders confronted a different kind of danger. A report reached Moultrie that Clinton had landed troops between the fort and Thompson's position. If true, the garrison would soon face an attack from the rear. Moultrie ordered the cannons silenced and reserved the remaining powder for infantry combat. For roughly 90 minutes, British shots continued to strike the fort without an artillery reply. Only after the report proved false did the American guns resume firing. During that interval, a British ball broke the fort's flagstaff and sent the blue crescent flag down onto the beach. In 18th century battle, falling colors could suggest defeat or surrender. Sergeant William Jasper climbed out under fire, recovered the flag, cut it from the broken staff, and fastened it to a gunner's sponge. He planted it again where both sides could see it. The act did not change the depth of the inlet or the strength of the walls, but it answered a question that mattered inside the fort. The garrison was still holding, and it intended the fleet to know it. Late in the afternoon, Lee reached the position he had expected to become a slaughter pen. He found the walls intact enough to fight from, and the defenders calm. His judgment changed with the evidence before him. Lee told Moultrie that he was doing well and had no need of assistance. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the defense had survived the danger Lee had accurately recognized, though not in the way he had predicted. As daylight faded, Parker's position became untenable. Ammunition was running low, the tide was falling, and his principal ships were badly damaged. After more than 9 hours of combat, the squadron withdrew toward 5-fathom hole. Action could not be recovered. Her crew abandoned her and set her on fire the following morning. Americans reached the stranded frigate before the flames consumed it, removed stores and trophies, and turned some of its guns against the retreating enemy before leaving the wreck. The scale of the exchange showed how thoroughly the expected relationship of force had been reversed. British ships fired an estimated 7,000 rounds and consumed more than 12 tons of powder. The Americans fired about 960 rounds, yet the Patriot garrison lost 12 men killed and 26 wounded, while British casualties exceeded 201 frigate was destroyed. Numbers alone do not explain the victory, but they reveal the efficiency of Moultrie's method. The side with fewer guns had used them against more vulnerable targets, while the side with the larger arsenal had spent much of its power against walls designed by circumstance to absorb it. The casualty totals also correct the image of an effortless American triumph. Men inside the fort were killed at their posts, gun carriages were damaged, and the prolonged bombardment imposed hours of extreme danger. The defensive design reduced losses, it did not remove them. Victory depended on the garrison continuing to operate after seeing British fire kill comrades and after believing, for a time, that enemy infantry might be behind them. Their achievement was endurance under uncertainty, not immunity from the battle around them. No single error doomed the British expedition. The reported ford at Breach Inlet was wrong. The Army lacked enough boats to replace the missing crossing. The Navy and Army did not coordinate their attacks effectively. The flanking frigates grounded. Parker underestimated both the fort's materials and the discipline of its defenders. Local pilots would later be accused of error or deliberate misdirection, but their intentions remain uncertain. What can be said with confidence is that a chain of assumptions had been allowed to stand in place of a tested plan. Afterward, British officers emphasized different links in that chain. Parker defended the naval effort and argued that a practical landing had not supported it. Clinton described the depth of Breach Inlet as a central source of the expedition's failure. Others pointed to the repeated accidents that had frustrated the plan. Their explanations contained elements of truth, but they also reflected the rivalry between Army and Navy. The operation had never established a single command capable of reconciling Parker's desire for a direct attack with Clinton's growing doubts about the land approach. The Americans benefited from more than British failure. Thompson's force sealed the northern approach. Rutledge kept the fort occupied and sent powder when it was needed. Enslaved laborers and other workers had built the walls that endured the bombardment. Moultrie's officers and men controlled their fire under conditions that encouraged panic. Jasper's recovery of the colors gave that endurance a visible symbol. The result came from a defensive system whose separate parts held long enough to support one another. News of Sullivan's Island arrived at a critical moment. The battle occurred less than a week before Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The rebellion had already produced victories on land, but defeating a major Royal Navy attack carried a different psychological weight. General George Washington shared the result with the Army preparing to defend New York and presented it as an example of what determined troops could accomplish. The victory did not prove that independence was inevitable. It demonstrated that British military power, even at sea, could be resisted when local conditions and disciplined defense worked against it. In Britain, the defeat invited blame and ridicule. Parker's damaged clothing became material for satire, but the larger embarrassment was strategic. A costly expedition had failed to secure a city that British commanders had considered vulnerable. In the colonies, the meaning was almost the reverse. The victory supplied a concrete story of resistance at the moment independence was being declared. An incomplete local fort had held against a celebrated navy. That story simplified the battle, but it helped transform a regional defense into a national example. South Carolina's legislature soon renamed the position Fort Moultrie. In September, Moultrie became a brigadier general in the Continental Army. Clinton's force remained nearby for a time, then sailed north to join the New York campaign. Charlestown received nearly 4 years in which it was free from British occupation. That interval mattered, but the victory did not make the city permanently secure. When the British returned in 1780, they used a larger, more methodical campaign and approached primarily from the land. Charlestown surrendered in May, and Moultrie became a prisoner. During his captivity at Hadrell's Point and Snee Farm, Moultrie served as a representative for fellow Continental prisoners and protested harsh treatment by the British commandant. He was exchanged in early 1782 and promoted to Major General later that year. After the war, he returned to public life. He served as governor of South Carolina from 1785 to 1787, and again from 1792 to 1794. In 1802, he published his 2-volume Memoirs of the American Revolution, an important first-hand account of the war in the South. He died in Charlestown on September 27, 1805, at the age of 74. The visual legacy of the battle developed over a much longer period. Moultrie's blue flag and white crescent became part of South Carolina's political memory. The palmetto tree was added to the state flag in 1861, linking the symbol to the log fort that had resisted Parker's cannon. Fort Moultrie itself was rebuilt and modernized repeatedly as military technology changed. The site remained an active post through World War II and was decommissioned in 1947. Almost nothing in its later concrete defenses resembled the unfinished enclosure of 1776, but the location continued to guard the same harbor entrance. It is tempting to reduce Sullivan's Island to a simple image, a tree defeating a navy. The truth is more instructive. Palmetto and sand made the fort resilient, but materials required labor to become defenses. Cannon required discipline to become accurate fire. Geography became an advantage only because Thompson's men held the inlet and British planners misunderstood it. Moultrie's importance lay not in possessing some secret weapon, but in recognizing what his position could do, conserving what little he had, and refusing to abandon a defense that others considered impossible. Britain did not lose the South that day, and the revolution was far from decided. But at the entrance to Charlestown Harbor, the Royal Navy discovered that superiority on paper could be undone by terrain, preparation, and judgment. That was the real meaning of the Palmetto Walls.